Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe, but you can call me KC. In today's video, we're doing the third and final episode of my 2024 reading tier list. This time, I'm hoping for a little bit of a shorter video than the last couple times, not just because there's less items to talk about, but also, and in fact, mostly, because we're talking about short stories and novellas and the like. So that's basically what we're going to be doing. If you missed the first two parts of this where I talked about the actual novels and similar, there's some fudging of the lines there a little bit of what I read, go check out those other two videos at the very end of this video. In fact, maybe even up there, I'll link the 2024 year-end content playlist. If that's how my brain worded it and that was correct, that's how we're going to go with it. I'm tired a little bit at the time that I'm recording this video, but that's neither here nor there. Let's switch over to the desktop, where I'm going to actually move my face cam back up to the top corner like it was at before, so that you can probably see all of the things that I'm going to be talking about in this video. Now, some of these are going to be a little bit confusing to look at here, and in fact, I'm going to have to reference my list over to the side a little bit as we go on, because getting individual short stories in Goodreads can kind of be a struggle some days, and depending on how things are going. But let's go ahead and begin. And in fact, instead of going with all the short stories that are here at first, let's talk about some of the novellas, the more substantial works that I read in 2024 for this list. First off, we're going to talk about Chess Story by Stefan Zweig. And I apologize for all the other videos that I have talked about that story up to this point. I was just completely ignorant and stupid about the fact that EI in German is an I sound and not, you know, Zweig was how I kept on pronouncing the last name before. Reen, why did you never correct me on this? Like, seriously, that was very, very silly of you, and I made a fool of myself by just completely butchering this guy's name. Stefan Zweig is the name, and even then I'm probably still pronouncing it wrong, but that would be a horrific irony. Anyway, Chess Story is a great little novella that a lot of people love, myself included. The edition shown on screen here, do not read the introduction of that. It actually spoils a couple of the author's other stories, unfortunately. But the story itself is great. It goes on very many twists and turns that I wasn't expecting it to go on. The vantage from which it covers, the material that it covers, is surprising. You wouldn't think that a story about a couple of top-tier chess players and kind of the backstory of how each of them got to be top-tier chess players would be interesting, but there's a certain psychological elements to that make it quite good. I'm actually going to put this in cream of the crop because it is very, very good novella. Next up is going to be The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy, who has quickly become one of my more favorite authors. The Death of Ivan Ilyich is a very philosophically intriguing story. If you find the concept of death, what happens after we die, making meaning of your life, if you find those kind of topics not very interesting, you might not enjoy Death of Ivan Ilyich very much. But if you do find those interesting, and especially if you struggle with some of those kinds of topics yourself, if you are someone who's prone towards, say, like existential anxiety or something like that, Death of Ivan Ilyich is going to hit you pretty hard. It definitely hit me pretty hard. It was very interesting to think about. I'm going to put in pretty dang good because while it was very good, it didn't quite cross the threshold of being fantastic in my mind, and I don't even really know the reasons why. I think when I wrote a review for this one, I couldn't fully explain why it was, but that's just kind of the way things are. Very good, very worth reading, but not my favorite thing in the world. Next up is going to be The Sandman by, oh man, what's the author's name? It's something Hoffman. Let me double check on that name so I'm not making more of a fool of myself than I already am. The Sandman by E.T.A. Hoffman, so I was right on the last name. But yeah, The Sandman is a classic German, like, fairy tale-esque type of story. It's kind of, well, The Sandman is based off of a fairy tale, if my understanding of that is correct. This is a very intriguing story as well. There's a lot of really interesting thematic ideas going on here. There's some twists on the traditional, like, fairy tale-esque, maybe fairy tale is not the right word. The folkloric side of the story, I suppose you could put it, is pretty interesting how Hoffman handles that material. I found the story, like I said, quite thematically interesting. In fact, the Short Story Sundays video that I did on this one, I think was by far the longest of any of the other videos, because trying to explain my thoughts on the different things that were going on was a little bit more difficult as a result of being more interesting and deeper than the rest of the stories that I read. I think The Sandman is pretty good as well. It wasn't It wasn't a story that I loved, however, I thought it was very rough around the edges. Not necessarily a story that was for me, but it was good in its own way, and I do appreciate the fact that it made me think so much. The fact that it made me think probably should put it in pretty dang good instead of rough around the edges, but I didn't much enjoy the story itself. It kind of had an eclectic nature, too many things going on that I found a little bit more difficult to follow. Next up is The Sunset Limited by Cormac McCarthy, which I'm including in the novella side of the storytelling instead of novels, because this is a play and it's like barely over an hour and a half long if you do the audio version of it. It's only a couple hundred pages in this play-like format. I didn't feel like it was substantial enough to call it a novel, so this is kind of an arbitrary distinction on my part, but nonetheless, The Sunset Limited is fantastic. A story that I read the first time and was like, this is really great, and then the end caught me off guard and kind of soured me on it. I reread it just a couple months later so that I could go into that and come to the ending of it with the mindset of like, oh, I know what's going to happen now, maybe I'll enjoy it more. I was still kind of turned off by the end even still, but the philosophical discussions, the religious discussions, the theological and philosophical, psychological discussions between the two main characters, the two only characters in this dialogue is what it is. It's an argument and dialogue the whole way through with only a handful of like stage directions in there. The arguments that are being made throughout the whole thing are really great because there's the part of you that like understands and gets what Black is saying. And then there's a part of you that understands and gets what White is saying, and which side you favor in this argument might shift over the course of the conversation. It's very thought-provoking. I thought it was fantastic. The only thing that I don't like about The Sunset Limited is the ending. Still don't particularly like that it went the way that it did. I didn't think that it needed to go that way. I would have preferred it go in a different direction. Personally, I would have preferred to end a little bit more positively than it does, even though I totally understand why it ends the way that it does. It's just maybe a little bit more dismal than I would prefer for an ending of the story of this kind of caliber. Even so, it is cream of the crop. It is just the fact that the ending is so jarring, and while I don't love the ending, the rest of it more than makes up for it. Goodbye Eri is also going to be another pick that's kind of controversial. I included a couple of manga in the novel section, or the couple of novel parts for the tier list. The reason I'm including Goodbye Eri in short story / novellas instead is because it's a one-shot, so it's literally only one volume, and it's also a short volume. It's only like 200 pages or something like that, whereas other stuff like Uzumaki is a 3-volume manga that I included there, and the monster stuff that I included in the novel sections were like the entire arcs, not just the volumes themselves, even though those volumes themselves are twice as long as Goodbye Eri anyway. Goodbye Eri is an very good story, to the point that even though I knew the vast majority of what was going to happen, I'd been spoiled through and through about the story, it still managed to make me cry twice, and for that reason, this is cream of the crop. Let's actually put Sunset Limited underneath. That feels a little bit more appropriate. Goodbye Eri is fantastic. There's some weirdness to the story that I don't particularly love, but at the same time, there's so much depth to the story and what is and isn't accurately portrayed, and the way that you could reread it a couple of times and have totally different interpretations, and the way that you can totally differently interpret every single step of this volume is just incredible. I've watched a few different spoiler talks on YouTube for it and been like, I didn't come to these conclusions at all, but I totally see where you're coming from. There's a ton of depth to Goodbye Eri for something that is so short, and like I said, it made me cry twice while reading it, even though I knew it was going to happen. But this is one that if you can go into it spoiler free, I recommend you do so. It is amazing. It is really special. If we were being a little bit more honest, this should be like in a tier all its own, like in accordance with all of the rest of the stuff in this list. Goodbye Eri is something special. It's, to this day, of all of the manga stuff that I've read, probably my favorite individual volume of manga that I've read at this point. And I haven't read a lot of manga, but like it's very good. Now we're going to move on to the 17 or something short stories that I read over the course of the year. Let's go ahead and blitz through these real quick. First up is Mitzingerstein by Edgar Allan Poe, which is a really surreal and interesting story with a lot of thematic depth to it. This one I really liked reading. I didn't particularly love reading it while I was reading it, but the more that I dug into it after the fact, the more that I think about it after the fact, the better it gets. I'm going to go ahead and put this at the top of pretty dang good, actually. I think that like the amount of depth that I just forgot to or didn't consider to go into for the Short Story Sundays video on Metzengerstein is astounding and embarrassing because there's a ton to it and I really liked it. The Beast in the Cave is a similar story by H.P. Lovecraft. I'm also going to put this in pretty dang good. I think that despite being considered one of his weaker stories because it was like the first story that he ever wrote, The Beast in the Cave is great. The atmosphere of it is great. The tone of it is great. The only thing about The Beast in the Cave that isn't great is when he just completely explains exactly what's going on in the last few paragraphs, which is apparently something that he does a lot in the first, handful of stories that he wrote. But I forgive The Beast in the Cave for that, mostly because the tone and the atmosphere and everything is great. I think the writing is pretty good as well. People say that Lovecraft doesn't have very good writing. I thought the writing in The Beast in the Cave was pretty good, especially for as young of a writer as he was at the time. The Duc de la Omelette by Edgar Allan Poe, however, is not very good. I mean, like, it's got some interesting ideas. It's got some satirical elements that are actually kind of funny. And a really, really great depiction of hell. For example, the evocative imagery of it is pretty good. But as for like the actual story itself and making sense of any of that material, it's a little bit more So I'm going to put it in better luck next time. I didn't like it a whole lot. Next up is The Alchemist by H.P. Lovecraft, which isn't as good as The Beast in the Cave. I'm going to go ahead and put this in rough around the edges. This also suffers from that same thing that The Beast in the Cave does, as like the answer to the mystery that is being built up through the whole several pages of the short story is just explained in the very last line, literally in all caps of the story. Which is very disappointing because, like, if you trust the reader to get to that point, which obviously Lovecraft as an early writer didn't trust the reader to get to that point, you can come to that point over those stories of writing. The way that Lovecraft is able to draw these things together and make points that you're able to answer the question for yourself, like, what the answer is. He doesn't have to say it, but then he does, which just inherently, lowers the quality of the story as a whole. But for the most part, it's a pretty good story as well. The same way that The Beast in the Cave is, but maybe not as good for me. Like, the atmosphere and the tone of The Beast in the Cave are a lot of what make that so compelling, whereas The Alchemist doesn't quite have as much of that going on. Next up is, I believe it's called Voice in the Night. It might be The Voice in the Night by William Hope Hodgson, which is a really good story tonally. Similar to Beast in the Cave, the evocative imagery and the tone that is able to come through with Hodgson's narration of the story is really good. It's actually really intriguing to find out little bits more about the mystery. You're kind of horrified and also like intrigued and interested. You want to know more, but you also don't know if you really want to know more about what's going on with like the voice in the night and like what the situation is for what the livelihood, the way life is for the voice in the night. Very poor explanation of the story. I know, I'm sorry, but like the story's great. I think this is pretty dang good. I think it could be better. Well, let's actually rearrange a couple things here. This looks a little bit. This looks good to me. Voice in the Night is a very good story. It's not as memorable as some other short stories that I covered for Short Story Sundays this year, but it is very good nonetheless. Next up is A Tale of Jerusalem by Edgar Allan Poe, and this one is one that I'm also going to put in better luck next time. Is a similar situation of like there are some moments in here that are genuinely really funny. If you understand some of the historical context of the time, if you've also read a lot of the Bible and therefore understand some of the context embedded to Jerusalem and that kind of area historically, there's a lot of like subtextual meaning that you can get from A Tale of Jerusalem, but because it is in and of itself mostly a satire, kind of the same way that the Duc de la Omelette is, there's some things that left me a little bit wanting, even though it is an entertaining read. Next up is The Tomb by H.P. Lovecraft, which I think is definitely an improvement upon The Alchemist, and I think goes in pretty dang good. Well, actually, I'm going to put rough around the edges. The Tomb has, again, pretty good imagery, as pretty good prose, gets you stuck in a narrator's head that is actually very convincing. The narrator for the story is really good, determining what did and didn't happen, what is and isn't true, what has and hasn't been manipulated, and to what degree any of those elements is kind of the true story is a joy to figure out with the Tomb. I really enjoyed a lot of it. There's some answers to questions that you get in the story that weren't necessarily to my liking, but luckily Lovecraft didn't necessarily like spoil the whole story in this one, because the narrator is meant to be like kind of a madman, so you have to question those things, and he actually trusted you to question those things. I think it's quality, but it maybe wasn't quite up to my liking tonally the way that like The Beast in the Cave was, even though I think it is probably a better executed story than Beast in the Cave. Beast in the Cave just hit all the right places for me. Next up is To Build a Fire by Jack London, which is a great little short story. I'm just going to go ahead and put this right up in cream of the crop immediately. The writing of this is great. The atmosphere of this is great. The imagery, again, is great. The tension of this is great. If you live anywhere where you have harsh or severe or like snowy winters, like this story is going to feel all too real to you, because like the worst of storms, you can like imagine yourself out in there. You've had experiences where you've been stuck out there in there to some degree, and you're like, this is absolutely horrifying. This story is like, this would be terrible. And it ends in just the right way for all of that to come together and be like, yeah, it really gives the goosebumps. It is a very well executed story. I commend London for writing it. I do need to read a little bit more of London as a general rule, but especially more of his stuff that is written like this. Very, very good story. Next up is The Whole Town Sleeping by Ray Bradbury, which I'm also going to put in cream of the crop, but just above. I'm actually going to put this above The Sunset Limited. This is a very, I say tone and imagery and stuff a lot in this video, and I'm sorry, but the tone of The Whole Town Sleeping by Bradbury is fantastic. His prose is great. His character work in the story is great. The story in general felt like it was ripped straight from something like Abbott and Costello or some of those older like black and white shows of the old day, except something along more of the horror side of things. Very, very good and interesting story. And I think it does a very good job of making you wonder really what happened at the end. It's not necessarily what happened that is in question, but more like the perpetrator, like what is and isn't true about the rumors going around the town. Very good, very good. I really, really enjoyed the story, and like, I need to read more Bradbury. The story was fantastic. And next up is Loss of Breath by, who is Loss of Breath by? Why don't I? Oh, Loss of Breath by Edgar Allan Poe. Okay, I remember this story now. This one is a weird one. Like, really, really weird one. I'm going to put this in better luck next time. Again, it's another one of those like satirical type of stories. Like, a lot of Poe's work was this kind of satirical kind of thing. But like, there's a lot to interpret there. There's a lot of subtext in the story. There's a lot that you can dig into, but I find the general execution of the writing of it to be more like, what am I even reading kind of thing, rather than like, ooh, what am I reading? Like, I want to know more. It's more like, what am I reading and why am I reading it for type of thing. So like, there's a lot to dig into with it, but I didn't really like it very much. Dagon by H.P. Lovecraft is going in cream of the crop, and yeah, that's actually where it's going to go. The only complaint I have with Dagon, literally the only complaint that I have with Dagon, is that it's only like 4 stories in the leatherbound edition of his complete fiction that I have. This story could have been like 3 times as long and been covered like no extra material, just used more words to describe the horror, and not even describe the horror, because he distinctively, Lovecraft doesn't tend to do that. More like he could have used those pages to like further deepen the tone, further deepen the imagery, further like get you engrossed into this narrator's head, and it is just fantastic. Once again, the tone of Dagon is absolutely perfect. It's 4 pages, like maybe the most perfect short story I've ever read, just in terms of like the efficiency of how good it is versus how short it is. It's just incredible. Very, very good. I love it a ton, knowing that a lot of his work kind of follows along some of those same tendencies. As long as I don't read a lot of it too close together, I think Lovecraft is going to be one of my favorite authors if I read more of his stuff, because like some of his early work here, as much as I enjoyed like The Beast in the Cave and Dagon, I think he's going to be a favorite of mine. The Thing Invisible by William Hope Hodgson is also a cream of the crop story. There's a lot of these. I had a great train there, basically approaching the end of Short Story Sundays, where like every short story I read was like a 5 out of 5, 10 out of 10 banger even, like just absolutely phenomenal. The Thing Invisible is another example. This is a Carnacki the Ghost Hunter or Carnacki the Ghost Finder story, and first, or at least one of the entries in a series of like 6 or 7 short stories that Hodgson wrote, revolving around Carnacki, who's kind of like a detective regarding like mysterious things. And like apparently some of the stories end with like actual ghosts. Some of them are more explained mechanisms. Everything about The Thing Invisible was fantastic. It was like 20 pages, but it felt like it was 50. And I don't mean that in the bad way, by the way. I mean like the 20 pages are so condensed and consolidated. The material is so well packed in there that it could have been 50 pages. And like most other writers would have been lucky to write all of that in 50 pages and had it be as good. The Thing Invisible is incredible. If you like a good mystery story, The Thing Invisible is definitely for you. The fact that I haven't gone back and read more Carnacki specifically is a sin to myself, and I feel really bad about it. But like, that story is incredible. Next up, we're going to talk about 3 short stories that I didn't cover for Short Story Sundays to any degree. These are stories that I read relatively recently. These are the Demigods and Magician stories, so crossovers between the Percy Jackson universe and the King Chronicles universe by Rick Riordan. So first up is the Son of Sotep. Is that what it's called? I don't even know off the top of my head what it's called. I formatted this tier list wrong, so that instead of getting the full image, it's just squares. Either way, the first story of these is pretty okay. It's really rough around the edges. It's just okay Rick Riordan stuff. I don't think Percy's narration in this story is very standout compared to some of the other things that Riordan has done. I don't think that the conceit for bringing Carter and Percy together is very interesting in this story. I don't think the story in general really has much reason to exist beyond trying to converge these two storylines, whereas the sequel, The Staff of Serapis, is pretty dang good. In fact, if you really like Riordan, especially if you like Riordan climaxes, this entire story is basically a Riordan climax, just all in one. I think it's a great story. The convergence between Sadie Kane and Annabeth Chase is a lot better. Annabeth as a narrator is a lot better. Everything about this story is pretty great. Like I said, it feels big and momentous the way that Riordan climaxes tend to be, except it's in the form of a short story. And then finally, Crown of Ptolemy, the third story in this, I'm going to put at like the bottom of pretty dang good, I guess, because it's just combining the stuff. I think Percy's narration, again, is notably weaker than Annabeth's would have been for the story, but basically as like a culmination for this little trilogy of shorts, it was definitely serviceable and enjoyable. I see why Riordan did it to kind of establish that, yeah, these universes are actually like all in one, and there's some interesting things that you can do with that. Mythologically, the idea that Ptolemy, who existed during a time when Greek/Roman and Egyptian like mythological influences were converging, specifically through Ptolemy, and using that as an excuse to bring these universes together is a creative way to do so, rather than just ham-fisting them together, compared to the first story, which felt like it was ham-fisting them together, whereas the second and third one made more obvious why that was the case. So this is my ranking for short stories and novellas. I think this is a pretty good ranking. Yeah, there were some banger stories in there, and it's now making me realize just how silly I've been to not continue reading short stories after I continued Short Story Sundays. I really wanted to make that a point, and I should make that a point in 2025. It's just so hard to prioritize reading a random short story when like I have books to read, you know? I don't know why. Short Story Sundays gave me a reason to read short stories, but the series wasn't working out very well. I need to find some other reason, some other excuse to read short stories and do them for the book binge in some way that is still fun and interesting. Like I said, that gives me a reason and excuse to read short stories, because several of these were really good and I really want to read more of them. Like more Bradbury would be great, more London would be great, more Carnacki by Hodgson would be fantastic. I really want to read more of that. I really want to read more Lovecraft. I'm still interested in reading more Poe, but I've been less hype on Poe as time has gone on than Lovecraft, at least for the early stories anyway. The point is I need to read more short stories, and I'd like to make a point of that. So either way, thank you for watching this tier list. If you did, that is the tier list now. And I hope you enjoyed your time watching the video. If you did watch the whole thing, I really appreciate you. It means a whole ton to me. And thank you for checking out any and all of the January videos this year. This January has been absolutely packed between these two channels of mine. It's been actually insane trying to get all this stuff done. In fact, at the time that I'm recording this, I still have most of that work, like more than 2/3 of that work left to do, probably like 4/5 of that work left to do for the rest of the month. So I'm just trying to plow through it. Going okay right now, but man, does it get exhausting sometimes, and I really hope that you guys have been enjoying it. But with that being said, for now, I have been your host, King Crusoe, but you can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video, whatever that may be.